Well, good morning, everyone. Dave. My name is Mark Andrus. I'm the care pastor here at Ironwood Church. And I'm both excited and nervous to preach this message today. Excited in an interesting way just because in care and counseling ministry, which is what I do, I interact with a lot of these themes we're going to be talking about today on a pretty regular, daily, weekly basis. Treachery, betrayal, sexual assault. And so I can connect with a lot of these stories. I have a lot of experience over the past 12 years just kind of walking alongside people. And so there's a bit of a perspective that I have just based on ministry that I've been able to participate in. So it's, like I said, a strange way, I'm kind of excited to preach that. I'm also nervous to preach it because my anticipation is, for many of you, the things we're going to talk about today are going to hit you in ways that will create pain, discomfort, may bring back different memories. And I'm just keenly aware of the fact that in 30, 35 minutes, I won't have the capacity that I wish I had to care personally for each one of you who are affected in those ways. So I just wanted you to hear that from me on the front end and let you know kind of where we're headed today as we look at this passage on the defiling of Dinah from Genesis 34. But I want to start today by telling you about the first movie that made me cry. Now, I am a softie. I do cry at basically every other episode of Bluey. So do all of you. If you haven't, you should watch it, and then you will cry, and then you won't laugh at me anymore. But the first time I can remember crying at a movie or a TV show was this movie that came out in 1996. It's called A Time to Kill. I was way too young to be watching it. I don't know where my parents were or why I did watch it, but I did. And long story short, A Time to Kill is about Carl Lee Haley, portrayed by Samuel L. Jackson, African-American man, whose young daughter is brutally sexually assaulted and almost killed by a handful of young white males. And they go through a sham trial and get off with no punishment whatsoever, declared innocent. And so the injustice of the trial is those guys come out. Carl Lee Haley, the father of the girl who was assaulted, straight up murders them. And then obviously he gets arrested. He goes through this whole process, and a lawyer by the name, I can't remember what his name was in the movie, but he's portrayed by Matthew McConaughey, comes in and advocates for and defends and protects, ultimately gets Carl Lee Haley off the hook. He's found innocent, declared not guilty. And the scene that I remember crying at was after the verdict comes out, he comes out of the courtroom, and here's his daughter, who is finally healed, physically at least, from the assault that she suffered, jumps into his arms. There's this embrace, like this restoration has taken place. And I remember as a kid just weeping. I was maybe 11, 12, 13 years old when I saw it. But then I also remember having seen that going like, something still feels off. Like I'm really thrilled at, like, it feels like justice has taken place. And yet this guy is getting off the hook for murder, but I'm kind of happy about it. And it's the same degree I'm kind of mad at the other guys who got off the hook for the assault, but I was happy when they got killed. So there was like this internal conflict and tension. So that even as I'm weeping with joy at this reunion that's taking place between Carl Lee Haley and his daughter, something doesn't feel quite right. But that's the first movie I remember crying at. And as I was thinking about it this week, what I really love about that movie is how it really just beautifully portrays and painfully portrays the fullness of the human experience. There is family and relationships and joy and connection, and you see it at the beginning of the movie that many of us have. But then there's loss, right? This brokenness that comes in. There's external forces that come in, that the family is damaged and hurt. There's a failure of a system to fulfill its design to protect and to punish. In Carl Lee Haley, you see then this temptation that he gives into to take matters into his own hands. Well, there wasn't justice, so I'm going to bring my own. But then he has to wrestle with the consequences and the repercussions. The very thing that he felt he had to do to protect and advocate for his daughter may be the thing that keeps him from ever seeing his daughter again. But then the hope that comes from an advocate, where the lawyer comes in and fights for him and brings all these precedents in other cases and points out racial inequities. But everything that's a part of that movie is a part of the fullness of the human experience. And the reality is, every one of us have felt those kinds of tensions. Every one of us. If I gave you a few seconds, I'm sure every single one of us in this room could recall experiences, those kinds of similar internal conflicts, family, loss, system failure, taking matters into our own hands. What's going to happen? Oh my goodness, the joy and hope from an advocate. We all can connect with those kinds of experiences. It's the human story, it's our story, but it's also the story that we see in Genesis 34 that we're going to be looking at today. And as we examine this passage, here's the big idea we're going to be moving towards. That God's promises are to be received, not grasped. God's promises are to be received, not grasped. So before we get into it, let's pray. God, will you be present with us today? Will you speak through me for those who experience pain as a result of these topics? Will you bring comfort, the comfort of your presence? For those who maybe experience fear or guilt or shame because of some things we're talking about, God, I pray that you'd bring hope and grace. I pray this in your name. Amen. So as we go into this today, we're going to kind of start big picture. We're going to look at the overall context. Then we're going to examine some of the characters that are highlighted in this story. And then we're going to look at what I talk about as the cost of grasping. So context, characters, and then cost of grasping. The context of this story, remembering the author of Genesis is Moses. He is writing a story basically of the Israelites' family history before they go into the Promised Land. And he actually does something that I do quite often when I do premarital counseling, which is I talk with couples and I go, hey, let's interview your parents. What are some things that you remember from your childhood that you want to emulate that and you want to repeat those patterns and bring them into your new marriage and family unit you're forming? But also, what are some of the things that you experienced from your parents? You go, hey, I want to avoid that. I want to chart a different course. I want to create new patterns. And Moses, as he's giving a history lesson to people, he's doing that very thing. He's helping them understand, how did we get to this point? What's part of our story? What are the beautiful things that we need to emulate? What are the painful things we need to avoid? And this chapter in particular is one of the most painful lessons of, hey, here's stuff that's been a part of our family history that we need to make sure we don't repeat. And so then as we get into this story, the starting point for this is what Seth talked about last week in Genesis 32 and 33. Jacob is terrified about his reunion with Esau. He's worried that Esau is going to get mad and try to get him back, which would have been an understandable response. But he finds surprising favor from Esau, reconciliation, grace, forgiveness, reunion. And Esau says, hey, come follow me to Seir. We'll kind of grow up and have families there, and it'll be awesome. And Jacob says, okay, I'll follow you there. But he actually lies, and once Esau's gone, he goes to a different place. And that's where we pick up. So in this story, I'll just kind of walk through chronologically. It starts with Jacob's family settling in Shechem in the land of Canaan. At the end of chapter 33, Jacob came safely to Shechem. He camped before the city, and from the sons of Hamor, Shechem's father, he bought for 100 pieces of money the piece of land on which he'd pitched his tent. So he settles in Shechem, not Seir. So that's where the story starts. Now in Shechem, then, is where Genesis 34 takes place. And it begins with this terrifying account, verses 1 through 4 of chapter 34, where Dinah is assaulted. It says, Dinah, the daughter of Leah, went out to see the women of the land, and when Shechem, the son of Hamor the Hivite, the prince of the land, saw her, he seized her, lay with her, and humiliated her. And his soul was drawn to Dinah, the daughter of Jacob. He loved her and spoke tenderly to her. So he spoke to his father Hamor, saying, get me this girl for my wife. Now, I want to be very clear. What Shechem did is most commonly translated as he raped her. Some translations will go he assaulted, some will say defiled, some will say that he humiliated her. That's what the ESV translates. But every translation of this brings the idea of forcible coercion and violation, sexually assault, rape. He sees this girl, he sees and he seizes, I'm taking you, you're mine. She's assaulted. The response is baffling. So Jacob, in response to this assault, does nothing. Now Jacob heard in verse 5 that he defiled his daughter Dinah, but his sons were with his livestock in the field, so Jacob held his peace until they came. He held his peace. I'm not going to make a big stink of it. He does nothing. And actually, it seems like the only people, until the brothers show up here in a little bit, the people who primarily feel tension about this is actually Hamor and Shechem. Shechem is the one who did the rape, and Hamor is his father. And they're going, this could create some problems. So they actually come to Jacob and propose kind of a restoration. They have like, hey, we'll give you whatever you want, name the bride price, we'll make it right with you guys, but Shechem really loves her, so can we find a way to figure this out and make this family work? They feel the tension, and Jacob just remains silent. So then, Simeon and Levi, Dinah's brothers, they respond with clever deceit. So they, again, it should be Jacob speaking up, but instead it's the brothers who, for whatever reason, when Shechem says, hey, I'll do whatever you want, just give me Dinah to be my wife. In verse 13, the sons of Jacob answered Shechem and his father Hamor deceitfully. They said to them, we can't do this to give our sister to one who's uncircumcised, for that would be a disgrace to us. But on this condition we'll agree with you, that you will become as we are by every male among you being circumcised. Then we'll give our daughters to you, we'll take your daughters to ourselves, we'll be great, we'll be one people. But if you will not listen to us and be circumcised, then we will take our daughter and we will be gone. So Simeon and Levi go, hey, we'll make a deal with you. You can get what you want, but you have to do this one thing for us. And it's quite clever deceit. And for whatever reason, Shechem is like, I'm in. Like, this sounds great. I can't imagine ever being in that situation in the first place, let alone agreeing to causing pain to myself on purpose. But anyway, he says, yes, that's fine. It's actually, the Bible says, this seemed good to them. Like, this is a great plan. So Shechem says, I'm in. He convinces all the guys that are part of his establishment to be in. They get circumcised. Adult males, painful, long recovery time, no anesthetic at that moment, as far as we know of. And so they're in a long process of healing, and on day 3, Simeon and Levi come in and kill them all. And if you're like me, when you first read, they're like, that is awesome. Those dudes totally got what they deserved. He did this terrible thing to Dinah. The brothers stepped in. They did all this stuff. It's awesome. You're excited about it. But if you think a little bit more, you feel a similar tension, as I did when you see Carl Lee Haley murder those guys and then get restored to his daughter. Like, wait a second. Something doesn't quite sit just right. It's a little bit twisted, distorted justice here. We celebrate, but then we read the next verse and realize that everyone suffers. All their wealth, all their little ones and their wives, all that was in the houses, they captured and plundered. I'm not going to go into gory details, but the wives and the little ones that were captured and plundered, what they experienced was probably not nurturing and pleasant. It was probably more of what Dinah experienced from Shechem. And now suddenly we're not celebrating quite as much anymore. There's that tension that we feel again. That's the context in which the story is taking place. It's what we have to wrestle with. So in our context, then, now we're going to zoom in and look at 4 particular characters or sets of characters. The first is Dinah. Dinah is the suffering victim. She's marginalized. Even before you read about what happens to her, there's 2 interesting tidbits. One is, remember in Genesis 33 where Jacob is afraid that Esau is going to come after him. Jacob strategizes how to best protect himself and then the family he actually likes. So he puts his slaves and his servants and his concubines, but then he puts Leah and her kids, which would have included Dinah, out in front. So that if Esau came in all violent with a score to settle, well, those ones would get killed, and then Rachel and me and the kids will be able to get away. So already, Dinah is marginalized. She's put before Esau as a potential sacrifice. But then, even considering how Moses introduces her, Dinah, the daughter of Leah, not the daughter of Jacob, the daughter of that one, the one that he didn't want. Even in the way that she's presented, she's thought of then as less than. And then in the story, we see that she ends up being a voiceless victim and object. The only action she's credited with is she went out. And this is not some sort of lewd and lascivious, she was where she shouldn't have been sort of deal, which is hogwash. Most scholars tend to agree there was probably a festival that was taking place in the land, and she's going out with her friends to just be part of this festival. Nothing terrible. But after that, everything else is just something that happens to her. She's probably between the ages of 13 to 15 at this point, so she would have just gotten out of the age to be able to help or participate in VBS. And Shechem sees her and seizes her. He humiliated, he violated, he forces, he rapes, he coerces, he defiles. Regardless of what word you choose to use, it was vile, wicked, and evil. Should not have happened. But then see what he does next. His soul was drawn to Dinah, the daughter of Jacob. He loved the young woman and spoke tenderly to her. Imagine how disorienting or confusing that must have been for her. To have just been out with friends and have this guy who, he's the prince. Nobody says no to him. Everybody does whatever he says, and he takes, and he has his way, and he forces, and he assaults. The pain and the shame that would have caused her. How could I look my father and my brothers in the eyes? What shame have I brought to my family? And then to have the source of her greatest pain be the one who's speaking kind, affectionate, tender words over. How confused and disorienting that must have been for her. The word that is used to describe how Shechem looks at her is the same word that's used to describe how Isaac loved Esau and how Rebekah loved Jacob. It's this infatuation that elevates. There's a genuine source of delight, but it leads to an unhealthy involvement in the relationship. So there's a genuine expression of some kind of affection for her, but again, confusion, disorientation. And then she was unprotected. Her father did nothing to protect her, to bring justice. He just did nothing. And many of us in this room can relate to some of Dinah's experiences. The scale and severity of which is going to be different for all of us. But most of us know what it's like to have somebody who's supposed to love and care for us abdicate that role and leave us in a vulnerable position. Many of us know what it's like to have the person who says kind and sweet and loving things also be the person who assaults and berates and abuses. We're too familiar with this kind of pain. And that's why in our church we have care ministry, counseling, betrayal, trauma, recovery groups, small groups for support as people deal with the ongoing impact of that experience. So we have Dinah, suffering victim. We also have Shechem, who I describe as the passion-filled, desperate lover. Shechem's really fascinating. There's not much thought that goes into him at the beginning. He saw her, he seized her, and he lay with her. He's a slave to his instincts and desires. I want, I must have, I will take it. No thought, no like, hey, maybe I'll try to do this. Maybe I'll try to woo. Maybe if I can get her on board and we can nope, I'm taking, it's mine. He's a slave to his instincts and desires. And then the passion comes up. His soul is drawn to her, that infatuation. I will do whatever it takes. And it leads then to these desperate attempts to get it. When he tells Jacob and Dinah's brothers, you name the price, I will pay whatever it is so long as I can keep having her. They name the price, and again, why would anyone go along with that? And yet it seemed good and reasonable to him. He's passionate. He's desperate because of how he's slave to his instincts and desires. And many of us in this room in various ways can relate to Shechem. We can see ourselves in him. We have those passions and dreams and desires that aren't always for terrible things, but sometimes those seem to overtake us and we struggle to rein in those passions and dreams and desires. See that thing, that picture, the video, I know I shouldn't click on it, but I just can't help myself. I know I'm 2 drinks in already. I really don't need this third, but I just love how it relaxes me, and so I take more. Those desires that we just can't seem to conquer. We see ourselves in Shechem. And this is why, as a church, we practice church discipline, but also why we practice discipleship and provide counseling and addiction recovery and pornography addiction recovery. See, Jacob, and if I'm angry with anyone in this story, I feel like I should be angry with Shechem, but if I'm honest, I'm most angry with Jacob. He's emotionally detached calculator. I have a 12-year-old daughter, and I feel like all of me would be Carl Lee Haley. Something like that happens, it's going to be scorched earth. I don't care if I'm in jail for the rest of my life. I will have justice. And so to see Jacob hold his peace infuriates me. How could you see that and just go, He's emotionally detached. Where he should be angry, he feels nothing or pushes down whatever is there. And the language that's used in here is is really the same kind of language at a traditional wedding where they go, hey, if anybody knows a reason why these two shouldn't be wed, let them speak now or forever hold their peace. Holding his peace, it's this idea of consent. I have no reason to speak up. I'm okay with what's taking place. It's functionally what Jacob is communicating in his emotional detachment. And in abdicating that role, it then sets up Simeon and Levi, the brothers, to speak up, and it wasn't their job to do. So then they step in. But then when you go, well, why? How could Jacob not have cared? How could he not have been angry? Actually tells us why. It's because he's farsighted and calculating. Look down in verse 30. Jacob gets angry at Simeon and Levi for what they did, and he says, you have brought trouble on me by making me stink to the inhabitants of the land, the Canaanites and the Perizzites. My numbers are few, and if they gather themselves against me, attack me, I'll be destroyed, both I and my household. The reason why Jacob didn't speak up isn't because he didn't necessarily think it was wrong, but he's looking at that and going, if I make a stink, if I try to, exercise justice, like there's not many of us yet, there's a lot of them. If I make too big of a fuss, it might hurt the family legacy, so I'm going to sit this one out. He's farsighted, he's calculating. And the opposite of that is Simeon and Levi. They're the emotionally over-involved advocates. Now, they're right to be indignant and very angry, which is how verse 7 describes their initial response. They're right to be indignant and angry. But then, instead of the emotional attachment end of the spectrum that Jacob went to, they go all the way the other direction. They take on a role that wasn't theirs to play. They step in. Now, they do it decisively and swiftly. They make a plan. They trick these guys. There's clever deceit. But they're these over-involved advocates. They're in their wrath and their anger. No part do they pause and go, what would God have us do? Dad's not doing it. What should we do? Nope, they just go, here's the plan. Here's what we're going to do. And they kill everybody. Now, whereas Jacob is farsighted and calculating, the brothers are short-sighted and reckless. Jacob was willing to sacrifice Dinah as a pawn of a sort for the sake of the bigger picture, but the brothers were willing to sacrifice the bigger picture for the sake of their twisted version of justice that Dinah deserved. And I don't fault them for the decision they make. There's a part of me that admires them. And at the same time, I still feel that tension, like something isn't right. Something about this is twisted. It's like Jacob he didn't have enough Carl Lee Haley in him. And the brothers had a little bit too much Carl Lee Haley in them. And many of us can relate to Jacob. We have feared man. We've avoided consequences. We've taken a step back when we should have taken a step up. And people who we love and care for were hurt as a result of our passivity. Many of us can relate to Simeon and Levi, the brothers. We have chronic foot and mouth disease. We're impetuous. We jump into action without considering the consequences and the repercussions. We cause irreparable harm sometimes out of this passion we have to grasp and do what's right. And for those of us who channel some of that Jacob, we carry a lot of guilt and shame over things I should have done that I didn't. For those of us who are more like Simeon and Levi, we carry a lot of guilt and shame. I moved too quickly. In my swiftness, I hurt the very people I was trying to protect. And this reality is why the church preaches the good news of the gospel, that our sin, our shame, our guilt from our sins of commission and our sins of omission, all of that has been covered by Christ and is not forever counted against us. That's why the church exists. But what's interesting is the character that never showed up on the screen. You know who's never mentioned once in chapter 34? God. His name never makes an appearance. At no point does Jacob go, as he did in chapter 32, God, show us what to do. We don't know what to do. Protect us. At no point do the brothers go, God, how do you want us to execute justice? God is completely and totally left out of this story. And what we see then is all of these characters in the story are grasping. They're grasping, and it brings a cost with it. And that moves us into the third point we're looking at is the cost of grasping. We grasp for the promises that God has given us rather than receiving them. And so I want to look at the promises, a reminder of the promises that God gave Abraham and his family, which included Isaac and Jacob and everybody in the story. We see this in Genesis 12, 1 through 3. It says, the Lord said to Abram, go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you, and I will make of you a great nation, and I will bless you, make your name great so that you will be a blessing. I'll bless those who bless you, and him who dishonors you I will curse. And in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed. So God gives a set of promises, and in this story, everybody keeps grasping for the promises that God said, I'll do this, and they go, but what if I do it? Instead of receiving. So God promises blessing and inheritance. God says, I will give you the land. But here's this thing that we may have glossed over at the end of 33. And from the sons of Hamor, Shechem's father, Jacob bought for 100 pieces of money the piece of land on which he had pitched his tent. It's interesting. God says, I'll give it. And Jacob goes, but what if I buy it instead? What if I do it my way? And it's actually Jacob's deceit of Esau and his self-reliance for grasping to fulfill God's promises his own way. It sets the stage for this entire story. His grasping for inheritance and legacy and blessing and land put his entire family in a vulnerable position. He set the stage for all of this. God also promises family and purpose. I'll make you a great nation, I'll make your name great, and you will be a blessing to all the other nations. But then, what does Jacob do? He's willing to sacrifice the very family that God had given him as a fulfillment of his promise. Jacob sacrificed that family in order to protect his vision, grasp for his vision of what the future promise should look like. Well, I don't want to stink. What if the parasites and everybody kind of wipe us out because they don't like how we handle the thing with Dinah? He functionally thought, these other nations that God promised to drive out before us, they're somehow going to be a threat to God's promise. They're going to thwart God's promise. So I have to grasp for and protect God's promise. And in doing so, ironically sacrifices the family that God given that was already a fulfillment of God's promise. He's a family purpose that God gave, and he grasped for it. God also promises justice and protection. He says, I'll bless those who bless you, and those who curse you, I will curse. But then Simeon and Levi go, wait, no, I'll curse those who curse us. We'll figure out what that needs to look like. We've got this, God. We don't even need to ask you. Here, let's go. And they were rightly angry and indignant about the defiling of Dinah, but they take the very picture of God's covenant faithfulness to his people. Circumcision was a sign of God's covenant, setting those people apart. Like when that covenant was put in place, the promise God made was, I will be your God, you will be my people. This was the sign. And they take the sign of God's covenant faithfulness and defile that covenant picture by using it as a means of punishment. They respond to defiling with more defiling. Injustice begets injustice. What's the cost? The cost is the undeserved suffering of the women and children of the men that they killed. What they had to go through as a result. See, God's promises are to be received, not grasped. And when we grasp, the impact is more than we realize. And the message for us today is no different than it was when this story was originally given to the Israelites. A New Testament version of this warning we see in James chapter 4, verses 1 through 3. It says, what causes quarrels and what causes fights among you? Is it not this, that your passions are at war within you? You desire and do not have, so you murder. You covet and cannot obtain, so you fight and you quarrel. You do not have because you do not ask. You ask and do not receive because you ask wrongly to spend on your passions. What is James saying? Grasping will kill you, and it will hurt the people you think you love. When you grasp for that which God has already promised, you're not going to be able to get it for yourself. And when you don't get it, you'll grasp harder. We see it play out in the story. We see it play out in our lives. The pressure's on us. I have to somehow make God's promises take place. It's not working. So I lie, I compromise, I cheat, I steal. For me, just getting super vulnerable, one of the ways that I see this play out, when I grasp for affection, out of the fear of rejection, I will manipulate. The thing that makes me a good counselor is also the thing that when I'm in a really unhealthy spot, I can use to get what I want from you. I can get your affirmation. I can get your affection. I know how to play you like that. And that's something that I need to confess because it's a version of my own grasping. I'll manipulate when I'm grasping for affection rather than receiving the affection that God has already given me. When I grasp for affirmation and purpose because of my own sense, fear of weakness and sense of meaninglessness, in the counseling room, I'll chart my own course. Like the brothers, I don't even pray. Well, I think here's the direction we need to go in. And I'll talk and and a lot of times maybe it's good counsel. But the internal thing that's playing out in there is I am grasping, like I need you to think that I'm a competent counselor. So I will say and do the things I think will get you there. And it might actually be the right things, but I'm doing it without God. I'm doing it without the Spirit. I'm charting my own course. I'm grasping. When I grasp for comfort out of fear of pain, I get impatient. I yell at my kids way too much. I like, when you have kids, it's loud. I always like loud. If you don't like loud, don't come here this week because it's going to be loud with 400 kids. This need that I have for comfort, for rest, for peace, I'll take matters in my own hands and I'll yell at my kids to try to get that which I could find if I turn towards Christ. When I grasp for joy out of the fear of missing out, I overindulge. My wife and I will joke a lot, and it's mostly just her rightly pointing out that I am full, and yet I'll get up from the dinner table, go into the pantry to get something else because I know I don't need to eat, but I still want more flavor. I love flavor. And then I just keep getting more, and it's like I'm grasping for this joy, a little bit more, instead of being content and resting in the promise fulfilled that God has already given me. What do you grasp for? What's the cost when you grasp for it? What compromises are you willing to make as you grasp for family, for relationship, for safety, for romance? Maybe you grasp for excitement or adventure. What are you willing to sacrifice to get that thrill? Maybe you grasp for understanding and knowledge that sets you up so that you can be the ruler of your own little kingdom, or you can be smarter than the people around you. What do you grasp for? And the question that we have to wrestle with and count the cost of is this: what does it cost when we grasp rather than receive? We lose our integrity. We say, this is who I am, this is what I believe to be true about God, but I'm going to take matters into my own hands. We lose our integrity. We end up losing relationships when we try to manipulate and control and get what I want from you rather than me just loving you. You'll pick up on that pretty quickly, and then that relationship is going to be gone because trust is broken. We lose trust. When we overindulge, often we'll lose our experience of God's blessing and His presence because He will sometimes give us over. Say, oh, this is what you think you want? Well, then I'll let you have it so you can see how that will never fail to fail you. We lose out on a lot. But the other thing we have to consider is this: who gets hurt when I grasp? Because the reality is God does not step on the vulnerable to fulfill His promises. But when we take God's promises into our own hands, we almost always do. Someone will get hurt and trampled when I am grasping. I will use you to get what I think that I need. You will use someone else that you love to get what you think you need in your attempt to grasp the thing that God wants you to receive from Him. Now, remember I said the thing that was missing from Genesis 34 was any reference to God whatsoever. And so it feels like the right thing to do then would be to consider the antithesis of what we see in Genesis 34. So instead of grasping, I suggest that we adopt a posture that sets us up to more readily receive the promises of God, and doing so in three ways. The first is to remember the invitation of God. To remember the invitation of God. Psalm 55:22 says, "Cast your cares on the Lord, and He will sustain you. He will never let the righteous fall." Hebrews 4:14-16 says that we do not have a high priest who is unable to sympathize with us in our weaknesses, but one who has been made like us in every respect, and has been tempted in every way as we are, yet without sin. So let us therefore with confidence draw near to the throne of grace to find mercy and help in time of need. The promise is when we draw near to God, He will draw near to us. And in those moments where it feels like God has promised, but I don't see that taking place. I don't understand, I'm confused. Instead of grasping, one of the steps towards receiving is to remember the invitation of God and draw near to him. And one of the ways I love to do that is through following the pattern of the Psalms. Now, there are Psalms of gratitude and joy and remembrance and praise. God, I know who you are. I see what you've done. Thank you for that. But I think we would benefit a lot from also following the patterns of the Psalms of imprecation. Crying out, God, bring justice and judgment upon wickedness and evildoers. From Psalms of confession, God, I myself am an evildoer and I need your grace and bring this before you. Psalms of lament, God, this hurts. I don't know what to do. Doesn't seem like things are getting better. We have an invitation from God to draw near to him, and the promise is that he will draw near to us as we do. So remembering the invitation of God, but also remembering the promises of God. In Deuteronomy 6, it talks about writing the words of God, writing the law of God on the door frame of the house, and then saying, hey, every time we go somewhere, we talk about God's law when we walk by the way, when we get up, when we lie down, when we rise. And so committing to memory the promises of God. That God has promised things not just to Abraham, but he's promised the same things to us. He's promised us blessing. Ephesians chapter 1 says we have been blessed with every spiritual blessing. Everything that we need has been given to us through the person of Jesus. And in that passage in Ephesians 1 also says that we share in the inheritance of Christ. That what Jesus deserves in terms of right relationship with God, the only one who deserves that has freely been given us. We've been adopted as sons and daughters of the King, and so we now have an inheritance that we could never grasp for or achieve or work enough for on our own. God has promised that to us. God has promised us land, the thing that Jacob grasped for. Revelation 21, there's a new heaven and new earth. That God is going to come and make all things new. And he's promised that for us, a land free of pain and suffering and sin and tears. And God has promised us justice. He will not overlook evil forever, but he will come and bring recompense and bring justice. We don't have to grasp for it. So we need to remember the invitation of God. We need to remember the promises of God. And the reality, if we remember the promises of God, if we become more fluent in those promises, we become less vulnerable to the temptation that Satan's been giving since Genesis 3. Did God really say he would do that? How can we answer that question unless we know what God actually said? The last thing we need to remember is we need to remember the Son of God through whom those promises are fulfilled. God in the flesh, Jesus, has lived the fullness of all these experiences that we've talked about today. He's lived through them not just as a model for how we should do it, but he's lived through it in order to be the perfect substitutionary sacrifice for us. Jesus is the true and better Dinah. He was the voiceless victim who was abused, rejected, unprotected, and abandoned. But not just as a cog in a story, but as the linchpin of the story, the climax of the story for us. Jesus is the true and better Shechem. He doesn't just love us with some kind of hormonally driven infatuation, but a passionate love for us that is confidently rooted in the love of the Father for him. And the love of Christ for us compels him to make a far greater sacrifice than the temporary pain that Shechem was willing to take in his body. Jesus is the true and better Jacob who absorbs shame and remains silent, not as some form of horrible self-preservation, but rather out of faith that God's will and plan for the redemption of mankind will be accomplished. And so, like a lamb led before the slaughter, he opened not his mouth. He redeems silence. Jesus is the true and better Simeon and Levi, who advocates fiercely on behalf of those he loves, you and me. But he does so in a way that upholds justice and mercy, rather than violating and distorting them both. I'm going to conclude our time now by actually leading us through a time of response to help us put into practice these remembering the invitation, remembering the promise, and remembering the Son. We're going to start by remembering the invitation of God. I've actually prepared a lament for violence. We've been looking at some pretty terrible things in this chapter and all throughout Genesis. And so I'm going to lead us through this prayer of lament. The words are going to be on the screen. I encourage you to just read them, pray them in your heart as you follow along. And afterwards, I'll lead us through a time of communion. There's this taking God up on his invitation, bringing this lament to him. God in heaven, you say that you're a loving Father, but if we're honest, sometimes that's hard to believe. Our hearts are heavy as we see these patterns of violence repeated over and over again in biblical history. Sexual violence, murder, treachery and deceit, the marginalized and oppressed further trampled underfoot. The image of God on display in human beings has been consistently distorted and desecrated. And we want to turn away because we can't take the pain anymore. And yet, we cannot turn away because these patterns of violence are not left in the past. They continue in the present. And our hearts are broken not only for the pain of our own experience, but even more so for the injustice that many of our loved ones have suffered. We don't want to look anymore, but we cannot bury our heads in the sand no matter how much we may want to. How long, O Lord, must we continue to face this pain? How long, O Lord, because it feels like evil is winning. We do not have what it takes to make it stop, and we do not have what it takes to endure. Holy God, hear from heaven and move here on earth. Bring your justice, bring an end to this violence. Turn your eyes toward us and incline your ear toward our cry. Stop and punish the evildoers. Preserve and protect those whose light evil seeks to extinguish. Comfort and bring peace to those whose lives have been assaulted. But, Holy God, bring not only your justice, but also your grace, because we are not innocent in this matter. In our own ways, we have contributed to and perpetrated these patterns of violence, and there are others who would justly cry out for our demise. Redeem us from our own sinful inclinations. We are weary, but we are not hopeless. Though we walk through the valley of the shadow of death, you are with us. Your rod and your staff, they comfort us. And in this promise, we take refuge even when it feels like we can barely take a breath.